Larry, you have a piece out in the Washington Post that really criticized the Senate version of the tax overhaul for eliminating that individual mandate, because you say literally it would cost thousands of lives. Give us some sense about that, and particularly, if that's right, shouldn't we be increasing how much we spend on health care? Where's the sky on this? Because you could save lives if you spent more.
Well, look, you save lives by causing more people to be insured, because then they get care faster and they get care better, and it works for them. You see that when you look at the phase-ins of expanded health insurance in Massachusetts, in other states. There have now been a variety of studies. Obviously, you've got to do it efficiently and without cost control. But look, I'm citing research done by people who worked in Republican administrations that's been peer-reviewed. And if you take that research literally, it would probably imply 10,000 lives a year. I think there are a lot of qualifications, and it's best to be cautious. So I think my statement that thousands will die in the future is a very conservative estimate of the consequences of this bill, and that's a very serious thing. So I sympathize with the people who worry about the various design issues in Obamacare. I sympathize with the people who think that ultimately we've got to get health care costs under better control, even with the progress we've made in recent years. But it can't be that the right thing to do in the United States is to throw 10 million people out of having health insurance. That is a prescription for more people to die. And look, this isn't a hypothetical thing. It used to be in the United States until 10 or 15 years ago, David, that if you looked at life expectancy for people in the upper part of the income distribution, people like you and I, and people in the lower part of the income distribution, they all move together. And now there's a really sharp divergence. Progress continues for people at the top, and progress has basically stopped for men below average. And that's got to be a sign that focusing on health equity is something that's essential for us to do. And this is just a step right in the wrong direction on that.
Well, you've also said that the tax approach overall is a step in the wrong direction, because we will not, among other reasons, we will not get the sort of economic growth that's being projected by some of the Republicans and also some conservative economists. How confident are you of that? I know you've gotten in a tussle a little bit with some of the conservative economists.
Look, there are no certainties about what will happen in the world. It might be 70 degrees on Christmas Day in New York, but it would be a crazy thing to make your base forecast. So, too, who knows what the growth rate will be over the next 10 years. Here's what we do know. We know that a whole variety of nonpartisan groups with real tax expertise have studied this bill and think its impact on growth is less than 0.1%. We know that 32 expert economists were surveyed by the University of Chicago, hardly a liberal stronghold, and of those, one expressed a view that this tax bill would substantially increase growth. And then we know that when Jason Furman and I tracked down the footnotes of the letter written by prominent Republican economists, the footnotes didn't say what those authors had claimed about the long-run impact of the bill on economic growth. So I think we're looking at a world where anything's possible, but where you can't look at the available evidence and think that claims that this bill is likely to pay for itself and increase growth are other than crazy stuff. And this is pretty serious. I was struck yesterday watching Meet the Press to see Senator Collins make the claim that it would raise revenues, and to rely on Republican economists Glenn Hubbard and Doug Holtz-Eakin for that claim. They've both in earlier writings contradicted the idea of self-financing tax cuts. They seem to have given some support to that idea in their most recent thing, but with the problematic footnotes that I mentioned. So I'm a little confused about where they stand.
So, Larry, let me ask you to do something very difficult, but you're an eminent economist. If, in fact, ultimately this proved to be otherwise, and in fact there was significant growth, what would have been different? What might have gone wrong in the consensus analysis?
So look, I think there are two answers to that, David. I think the most likely answer would be that we can't predict how quickly technological change flows into the economy and what happens to productivity. And if growth turns out to be 3 or 3.5% over the next 10 years, I think it'll probably be due to the way in which technology created a rush of productivity like it did in the 1990s, frankly, not due to tax policy. That's the most likely, really happy scenario. The alternative scenario is that somehow I've missed the boat, and this is going to create so much optimism and so much good feeling in businesses that they're just going to engage in a big surge of hiring and a big surge of investing. It was very interesting. I was at the Wall Street Journal's CEO Council conference 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the president's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, was there, and he gave a pep talk for the tax bill, as you'd expect him to, and there was some enthusiasm from a group of CEOs, as you'd expect. And then he asked, how many of you would significantly increase your investment if this tax bill passes? And only about 10% of the people in the room raised their hands. And he said, oh, come on, there must be more of you. And a couple more out of 100 raised their hands. So it was kind of the most visual repudiation of this view that cutting taxes is the key to setting off a boom that I've ever seen. You know, we had a boom when I worked in the Treasury Department in the 1990s. That boom was certainly not set off by these kinds of tax cuts. Very much the contrary. It was set off at the government level by fiscal prudence. So I don't think we saw an experiment with tax cuts fairly recently with the George W. Bush tax cuts in 2001 to 2003. And, you know, we saw a mediocre bubble-based economy give way to financial crisis after that. So I don't see the evidence for this view at all.
So finally, Larry, actually, tax is not the only thing on the agenda for Congress this month. They also have to address the question of keeping the government going, keeping it open. And there's a dispute, as you know, between generally Republicans saying we need to spend more on defense, Democrats saying if you're going to do that, you have to spend more on domestic policies. As an economist, should we be spending more on both or either?
My guess is we should be spending more on both. You look at what's happening in North Korea, you look at what's happening in the Middle East. I think you look at how rapidly the defense spending of our potential adversaries is growing. I think one of the big costs of this tax bill is that inevitably, by bloating the deficit, it's going to mean a reduction in hundreds of billions of dollars in defense spending over the next couple of decades, and I think we need that spending for our national security. I also think, looking at the potholes on the roads that cost Americans the equivalent of 75 cents a gallon in gasoline taxes, looking at the way in which funding for cancer cures has been cut at a moment when the science is bursting at the seams, looking at the fact that we may regret it, but we can't change the fact that we've got a population that is aging with more needs for public support of various kinds. I think we need more domestic spending and we need more military spending. And that's why taking a large amount of government resources and allocating it to the top 1% of the population seems to me to be a rather perverse priority. David, if I can take just one more minute, here's what I think your viewers should think about. We had an effort, ultimately, to my disappointment and that of many others, wasn't successful, half a dozen years ago, with the Bowles-Simpson process, where we brought a bipartisan group together and we tried to get the country's finances under long-run control. Those were not flaky liberals. Erskine Bowles is the director of Morgan Stanley. Alan Simpson was a prominent Republican senator. They are anything but flaky, big government liberals. Their conclusion and that of their commission, which included a number of Republican congressmen and senators, was that what we needed to do was stabilize things with 21% of GDP in revenue and 21% of GDP in spending for the foreseeable future. So the revenue target was 21% of GDP. This tax bill will leave us nearly 20% behind that target by setting a target of 4% of GDP less. That's about $700 billion a year less than Bowles and Simpson conservative bipartisan effort at deficit reduction. You cannot stay a great nation on a shoestring. And that's unfortunately what this bill risks condemning us to try to do.